Sometimes the mind builds walls not to keep the world out, but to keep the truth in. The morning Maggie Chen walked out of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. She carried 3 things with her: a 6-month pregnant belly that defied medical explanation, 30 years of buried memories clawing back to the surface, and the unshakable certainty that her 5 children were still alive, still waiting for their mother to come home. The December snow crunched beneath her bare feet as she traced the familiar path through Millbrook, Connecticut, past the corner drugstore where she used to buy Emma's cough drops, past the playground where the twins took their first steps, past the school where Rebecca sang in the Christmas pageant. But when she reached 1247 Elm Street, her heart stopped, where her 2-story Victorian home should have stood, where she'd bandaged scraped knees, read bedtime stories, and tucked 5 little souls safely into their beds. There was nothing but an empty lot covered in pristine snow, no foundation, no memories, no proof that the Chen family had ever existed. Neighbors who peered from their windows claimed the land had been vacant for decades. The town records showed no trace of her family. Even her own reflection seemed to whisper that maybe, just maybe, the doctors had been right all along. But how do you convince a mother's heart that her children were never real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maggie pressed her palms against the chain-link fence that bordered the empty lot, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The metal was so cold it burned, but she welcomed the pain. It meant this was real, that she was truly standing here, truly free after 3 decades of white walls and medication schedules. The pregnancy stirred within her, a flutter of movement that made her gasp. Impossible, the doctors had said. At 52, with her medical history, with the medications, impossible. But the baby kicked again, insistent and alive, just like the memories that had been flooding back for weeks now. "Emma," she whispered to the wind, remembering her eldest daughter's serious brown eyes, the way she'd mother-henned the younger ones. "Emma, where are you, sweetheart?" A woman emerged from the house next door, a tidy colonial that Maggie remembered belonging to Mrs. Patterson, though this woman looked far too young. She approached cautiously, phone already in her hand. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help?" Maggie turned, hope blazing in her chest. "Do you remember the Chen family? We lived right here, in the blue Victorian with the wraparound porch. My children, 5 of them. The twins were only 4 when—" She trailed off, seeing the blank confusion on the woman's face. "I'm sorry, but there's never been a house there. I've lived here for 15 years, and my grandmother owned this place before me. That lot's been empty since she was a girl." The woman's voice was gentle but firm. "Maybe you're thinking of a different street?" Maggie's chest tightened. "No, this is right. Look, there." She pointed to a gnarled oak tree at the back of the lot. "That's where Lucas buried his hamster, and there where that little depression is in the snow. That's where our front steps were. Lily used to sit there every morning, waiting for the school bus." The woman followed her gaze, but Maggie could see she saw nothing but an empty field. "Listen, you look cold. Why don't you come inside? I can make some coffee. Call someone for you." "No." Maggie backed away from the fence. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if responding to her distress. "No, I have to find them. They're waiting for me." She turned and walked quickly down Elm Street, her bare feet numb now against the concrete. The woman called after her, but Maggie didn't stop. She couldn't stop, not when she was so close to understanding what had happened to her family. The corner drugstore was still there, though it looked different, cleaner, more modern. Through the window she could see rows of bright packaging, where once there had been dusty shelves and Mr. Kim's hand-written price tags. She pushed through the door, wincing as warm air hit her frozen feet. The young clerk looked up from his magazine. "Hey, you can't come in here without shoes. Store policy." "Please," Maggie said, approaching the counter, "I just need to know. Do you have records? From the 1990s? My daughter Emma, She used to come here for cough drops, cherry-flavored. Mr. Kim always saved them for her behind the counter because they were her favorite. The clerk's expression shifted from annoyance to concern. Lady, I don't know any Mr. Kim. This place has been a CVS for like 20 years. And before that it was some other chain. Look, you're bleeding. Maggie glanced down at her feet. Dark spots of blood dotted the white linoleum where she stood. She hadn't even felt the cuts from walking on frozen pavement. The sight should have alarmed her, but instead it felt like proof, evidence that she was real, that this was happening, that somewhere in this altered world her children still existed. The playground, she said suddenly. Millbrook Elementary. They'll have records. She turned to leave, but the clerk was already reaching for his phone. Ma'am, I think you need medical attention. And maybe we should call... Maggie was out the door before he could finish. The playground was 6 blocks away, and she ran despite the pain in her feet, despite the weight of her pregnancy, despite the voice in her head that whispered the same words the doctors had been saying for 30 years. None of this is real, Margaret. Your children never existed. You created them to cope with your trauma. But the baby kicked again, and this time she felt tiny hands pressing against her ribs, as real as her own heartbeat. As real as the memory of Rebecca's laugh, Lucas's gap-toothed grin, Lily's fierce hugs, little Samuel's first word, Mama, spoken on a snowy December morning exactly like this one. Millbrook Elementary came into view, its red brick facade unchanged after all these years. If anywhere would have records of her children, it would be here. School registrations, report cards, something to prove that Emma Chen had walked these halls, that the twins had played on this very playground. Maggie pressed her hand to her belly and felt the baby settle, as if waiting. We're going to find them, she promised. Mama's going to bring everyone home. The school's front doors were locked, heavy glass barriers that reflected Maggie's wild appearance back at her, hospital gown torn and stained, graying hair escaping its braid, eyes bright with desperate determination. She pressed her face against the cold glass, cupping her hands to peer inside. The hallways looked smaller than she remembered, painted a cheerful yellow instead of the institutional green from 30 years ago. New motivational posters lined the walls where crayon artwork had once been displayed. But the layout was the same. Main office to the right, gymnasium straight ahead, kindergarten classrooms down the left corridor, where the twins had spent their days finger painting and learning to write their names. Lucas always pressed too hard with his pencil, she thought, breaking the lead. And Lily would get so frustrated when her letters didn't look perfect. Excuse me, you can't be here. Maggie turned to see a security guard approaching from the parking lot, his hand resting on his radio. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with kind eyes that reminded her of her father. I'm looking for records, she called out, not moving from the door. My children attended school here, the Chen children, Emma, Rebecca, Lucas, Lily, and Samuel. Samuel might have been too young for school when... She paused, realizing she still wasn't entirely sure when everything had changed, when her life had been erased. When did the fire happen? The guard slowed his approach, concern replacing suspicion. Ma'am, you're not wearing shoes. Are you hurt? Do you need medical attention? Please. Maggie's voice cracked. Just check your records. Emma Chen would be 32 now. She was in 2nd grade in 1993. Her teacher was Mrs. Rodriguez. She had a gap between her front teeth and always wore purple on Fridays. Emma loved her. The guard stopped a few feet away, studying Maggie's face. For a moment, she thought she saw recognition flicker in his eyes. Ma'am, I've been working security here for 15 years, and before that I was a custodian. The name doesn't ring a bell, but... He hesitated. Why don't we get you somewhere warm? I can call the principal, see if she can access older records. Hope bloomed in Maggie's chest. You'll check? You'll really check? I'll see what I can do. His voice was gentle. But first, let's get you some shoes and maybe a jacket. There's a lost and found box inside. As he unlocked the door, Maggie felt the baby shift, settling lower in her belly. She pressed her hand to the spot where tiny feet had been kicking and whispered, "See? Someone's going to help us." The hallways smelled like disinfectant and childhood, that particular combination of apple juice, construction paper, and floor wax that existed only in elementary schools. Maggie's bare feet were silent on the polished linoleum as she followed the guard to the main office. "Wait here," he said, settling her into a chair beside the principal's door. "I'm going to find you something to wear, and then make some calls." Alone in the office, Maggie studied the walls. Photos of recent graduating classes smiled down at her, children she didn't recognize, born into a world where her babies had never existed. But there, in the corner, hung older photographs, black and white images from the school's early days, then color photos from the 70s and 80s. She stood slowly, her pregnant belly making her movements awkward, and approached the wall. Her eyes scanned faces, looking for any trace of her children, any evidence that they had been real. In a 1993 class photo, she found Mrs. Rodriguez's second grade, but no Emma. In the kindergarten photo from 1992, no twins. They have to be here, she thought desperately. Emma was so proud of her perfect attendance certificate. Rebecca won the spelling bee 3 years running. The twins performed in the winter pageant. Lucas was a shepherd. Lily was an angel. The memories were so vivid she could smell the construction paper halos, hear the children's voices singing Silent Night off-key. But the photographs showed only strangers, only other people's children living lives that should have belonged to hers. "Found some sneakers that might fit," the guard said, returning with a shoebox and a thick winter coat. "Name's Frank, by the way." "Frank Morrison. Margaret Chen," she replied automatically, then corrected herself. "Maggie. Everyone called me Maggie." Frank knelt to help her with the shoes. Too big, but better than nothing. The coat smelled like mothballs and lost childhood, but it was warm. "Mrs. Patterson in the office is calling the principal now. She should be able to access records going back to the 70s. Maggie nodded, clutching the coat around her swollen middle. The baby had grown quiet, as if sensing her tension. Through the office window, she could see the playground where Lucas and Lily had spent countless recesses, where Rebecca had organized elaborate games of tag, where even tiny Samuel had toddled around the sandbox under Emma's watchful eye. They were real, she told herself fiercely. They are real, and I'm going to prove it. Mrs. Patterson emerged from the inner office, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose and a manila folder clutched in her hands. She was younger than Maggie expected for someone with access to decades-old records, maybe 45, with graying auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mrs. Chen," she said softly, settling into the chair across from Maggie. "Principal Davies asked me to help you with your inquiry. I've been the registrar here for 23 years, so I have access to most of our historical enrollment data." Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing the moment's importance. "Did you find them? Emma, Rebecca, Lucas, Lily, Samuel Chen?" Mrs. Patterson opened the folder carefully, her expression unreadable. "I searched our records thoroughly. Enrollment files, attendance records, even old report cards that we digitized a few years back." She paused, glancing at Frank, who had positioned himself near the door with the protective stance of someone prepared for bad news. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry, but there are no records of any Chen children ever being enrolled at Millbrook Elementary." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She gripped the arms of her chair, fighting against the familiar sensation of the world tilting sideways. "That's impossible. Check again. Maybe the name was misspelled or—" I checked multiple spellings. Chen, Chung, Chan. I also searched by first names only, in case there was a clerical error with the surname. Mrs. Patterson's voice was gentle but firm. "Mrs. Chen, our records are quite comprehensive. We have documentation going back to 1962, when the current filing system was established." Maggie stood abruptly, the oversized sneakers making her movements clumsy. "Then your records are wrong." Emma was in Mrs. Rodriguez's class, second grade, 1993. She had a reading level 3 grades above her age. Rebecca won the school spelling bee in 1991 with the word chrysanthemum. She practiced for weeks. Mrs. Chen. The twins were in the winter pageant. Maggie's voice rose, echoing off the office walls. December 1992. Lucas forgot his line about the star, and Lily helped him remember. The whole audience laughed, but it wasn't mean laughter. It was sweet. They were so proud wearing their costumes. Frank stepped closer, his hand extended in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, maybe we should—" "No." Maggie backed toward the window, her hand pressed protectively over her belly. "I know what you're thinking. You think I'm crazy, that I imagined them. That's what the doctor said for 30 years. But look at me, look at this baby. How do you explain this pregnancy if none of it was real?" Mrs. Patterson and Frank exchanged a glance that Maggie caught immediately. It was the look she'd seen countless times at Riverside, the careful, practiced expression medical professionals wore when dealing with delusional patients. "Mrs. Chen," Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "pregnancy can occur even in complicated circumstances. It doesn't necessarily validate other experiences." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Maggie felt something shift inside her, a cold certainty that crystallized around her spine. These people, kind as they seemed, were part of the same system that had erased her children's existence. The same system that had kept her locked away while her babies waited for her to come home. "You're lying," she said quietly. "Or someone's made you believe the lies. But I'm going to prove you wrong." Through the window, she noticed a figure approaching the school entrance. A woman in a long black coat, moving with purpose across the snowy parking lot. Something about her stride sent alarm bells through Maggie's mind. Official, authoritative, coming for her. Frank followed her gaze and straightened slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I think someone from the hospital is here to help you." Help. The word tasted bitter in Maggie's mouth. She'd had 30 years of their help, medications that clouded her mind, therapy sessions designed to convince her that love itself was a delusion, treatments that nearly made her forget the sound of Rebecca's laughter. The baby kicked suddenly, sharply, as if urging her to move. Maggie pressed her palm against the spot and felt what could only be tiny fingers pushing back, a secret communication between mother and child. In that moment, she faced a choice that would define everything that followed. She could stay, let them take her back to Riverside, submit to another 3 decades of being told her maternal instincts were symptoms of psychosis. Or she could run, keep searching, keep fighting for the truth that burned in her chest like a flame. The woman in black had reached the front doors. Maggie looked at Frank and Mrs. Patterson one last time. "When you see her," she said, backing toward the rear exit, "tell her that Maggie Chen knows her children are alive, and I'm going to find them." Before either could react, she was through the door and running across the playground, her oversized sneakers slipping on patches of ice as she fled toward the tree line that bordered the school property. Behind her, she heard Frank calling her name, but she didn't stop. The hunt for her children had truly begun. Maggie's lungs burned as she stumbled through the snow-laden pine trees, branches catching at the borrowed coat and scratching her face. The baby pressed heavily against her bladder, making each step a struggle, but she pushed deeper into the woods until the school's brick walls disappeared behind the evergreen curtain. Only then did she stop, gasping clouds of vapor into the frigid air. "What am I doing?" The question hit her with sudden, devastating clarity. She was a 52-year-old pregnant woman, barefoot except for stolen sneakers, running from people who only wanted to help her. She had no money, no identification, no plan beyond a desperate conviction that her children, no one else remembered, were somehow still alive. Maggie sank onto a fallen log, her body shaking from more than just the cold. The bark was rough beneath her hands, real and solid in a way that made her question everything else. Through the trees, she could hear voices calling her name, Frank's voice, kind and concerned. The woman in black had probably reached the office by now, was probably showing credentials, asking questions about the escaped psychiatric patient. Escaped. That's what she was now. a fugitive from the very institution that had fed her, clothed her, kept her safe for 3 decades. The baby shifted restlessly, and Maggie felt a sharp pain lance through her lower back. 6 months pregnant at 52, the doctors at Riverside would have called it impossible, another manifestation of her deteriorating mental state. But the weight was real, the kicks undeniable. When she pressed her palm to her belly, she could feel the distinct outline of a tiny foot. But whose baby? The thought crept in like poison. If your other children never existed, if 30 years of maternal love was just elaborate delusion, then what is this? She closed her eyes, trying to summon Emma's face, but for the first time in decades the image wavered. Had her eldest daughter really had brown eyes, or was she confusing her with someone else? Had Rebecca truly won that spelling bee, or had Maggie watched another child triumph and somehow absorbed the memory as her own? The voices were getting closer. Through the trees, she glimpsed the flash of Frank's security uniform and another figure in medical scrubs. They were following her trail through the snow. Not difficult, given her clumsy flight and the drops of blood from her cut feet, marking the way like breadcrumbs. Maggie forced herself to stand, every muscle protesting. She could surrender now. Walk back to them with her hands raised, let them wrap her in warm blankets and drive her back to Riverside. Accept the medications that would smooth the sharp edges of her desperation. Submit to therapy sessions that would gradually convince her that this pregnancy, like her memories of 5 children, was just her mind's way of processing unbearable loss. It would be easier. God, it would be so much easier than this. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Maggie gasped at the sudden intensity. As she doubled over, her hand brushing the snow, she saw something that made her heart stop. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree, barely visible beneath years of growth and weather, were initials EC plus MC, 1993. Emma Chen plus Mommy Chen. Maggie's fingers traced the faded letters, remembering the Swiss Army knife Emma had stolen from her older cousin, the serious concentration on her 8-year-old face as she worked the blade into the bark. "It means we'll always be together," Emma had said solemnly. "Even when I grow up and move away, this will be here to remember." The memory was so vivid, so achingly specific, that Maggie felt her doubts crumble. She might be wrong about everything else, the house, the school records, the very fabric of reality, but this carving was proof, physical evidence that couldn't be explained away by delusion or false memory. Emma had been real. They had all been real. The voices were almost upon her now. Maggie could hear the woman in black speaking into a radio, coordinating with hospital security. In minutes they would find her. And once they did, she would disappear back into Riverside's white corridors, probably into a higher security ward this time. The baby would be born there, taken away, and she would spend whatever years remained convinced that even this pregnancy had been imaginary. But she also knew, with terrible certainty, that she wasn't strong enough for another escape. At 52 and 6 months pregnant, this might be her only chance to uncover the truth about what had happened to her family. Maggie pressed her palm against the carved initials one last time, drawing strength from their weathered reality. Then she turned deeper into the woods, away from the searching voices, toward whatever answers waited in the cold December darkness. The baby settled as she walked, as if approving of her choice. Behind her, Frank's voice called her name one last time before fading into the whisper of wind through pine needles. The carved initials became Maggie's North Star as she pushed deeper into the woods, each step taking her further from the safety of surrender and closer to a truth that terrified her as much as it compelled her. The voices behind her had faded to nothing, swallowed by the dense evergreen canopy and the muffling weight of snow. She was truly alone now, more alone than she'd been in 30 years of institutional life, where every moment had been scheduled, supervised, controlled. The silence pressed against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by her labored breathing and the occasional crack of a branch beneath her feet. There's no going back. The realization settled over her like the falling snow, cold and absolute. Even if she changed her mind, even if terror drove her stumbling back toward the school, she was already a fugitive. The woman in black would have called in reinforcements by now. Every police officer in Millbrook would be looking for the escaped psychiatric patient, the pregnant woman who'd attacked a nurse and broken free from supervised care. The baby pressed against her ribs, a reminder that she wasn't just risking her own future. Whatever this child was, real or imagined, miracle or delusion, it deserved better than to be born in a padded room, to be taken away before she could count its fingers, before she could whisper its name. Maggie paused beside a massive pine tree, its trunk easily 3 feet across, and pressed her back against the rough bark. Her legs shook with exhaustion, and the oversized sneakers had rubbed blisters on her heels. But she was free. For the first time since that night 30 years ago, the night she could never quite remember, when everything had gone wrong, she was making her own choices. The forest stretched endlessly ahead, a maze of shadows and snow-covered paths that could hide her for hours, maybe days. But hiding wasn't enough. She needed answers. She needed to understand how 5 children could vanish, not just from the world, but from all record of ever having existed. Think, she commanded herself. You were a nurse once. You understood how systems worked, how information flowed through institutions. Where would they keep records they didn't want found? The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of sirens. Multiple vehicles, converging on the area. They were taking her escape seriously, deploying resources, coordinating search efforts. Soon there would be dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging equipment that could track her body heat through the canopy. She had to move. Maggie pushed off from the tree and continued deeper into the woods, following what looked like an old hiking trail. Her breath came in sharp puffs, and she could feel her heart racing, not just from exertion but from the magnitude of what she'd chosen. Every step carried her further from the known world of medication schedules and therapy sessions and careful, controlled safety. The baby kicked, a flutter of movement that felt like encouragement. Maggie placed her hand over the spot and whispered, "We're going to find them. Your brothers and sisters. They're out there somewhere. And we're going to bring this family back together." Saying the words aloud made them feel more real, more possible. For 30 years, she'd spoken of her children only in therapy sessions, only to doctors who nodded sympathetically while making notes about persistent delusions. Now she could speak their names to the wind, to the trees, to the child growing inside her. The path began to slope downward, and through gaps in the trees, Maggie could see lights in the distance. Not the harsh glare of search vehicles, but the warm yellow glow of houses, a neighborhood she didn't recognize, built where she remembered only farmland. Another piece of the world that had changed while she'd been locked away. But people lived in those houses. People who might have been here in 1993, who might remember the Chen family before they disappeared. Someone had to know something. A neighbor, a teacher, a doctor who'd treated scraped knees and childhood illnesses. Children didn't simply vanish without leaving traces in human memory. The sirens were getting closer, their wailing echoing through the trees like mechanical wolves. Maggie quickened her pace, ignoring the pain in her feet and the growing ache in her lower back. The baby had grown heavy, shifting her center of gravity and making the downhill walk treacherous on the icy path. As she reached the edge of the woods, she could see the neighborhood more clearly. 24 houses, maybe more, arranged in neat suburban rows. Holiday decorations twinkled in windows. Christmas trees, menorah lights, winter displays that spoke of families and traditions, and normal lives continuing their cycles. Somewhere in that grid of streets and sidewalks, she might find someone who remembered. Someone who knew that Margaret Chen had once been more than a psychiatric patient, that she'd been a mother who packed lunches and braided hair and stayed up all night with fevering babies. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if sensing her determination. Maggie took a deep breath of the cold air, tasting freedom and terror and desperate hope in equal measure. Then she stepped out of the trees and into her new life as a fugitive searching for children the world insisted had never existed. Behind her, the forest held its secrets. Ahead lay nothing but questions and the fading chance of answers. There was no going back. The neat suburban streets felt like a stage set. Too perfect, too carefully arranged, as if the whole neighborhood had been constructed while she slept. Maggie crouched behind a mailbox shaped like a miniature barn, watching patrol cars cruise slowly through the development. Their searchlights swept across yards and driveways, hunting for her with mechanical persistence. The baby pressed against her bladder, demanding attention she couldn't afford to give. How long had she been running? The winter sun hung low behind grey clouds, making it impossible to judge the time, but her body ached with the bone-deep exhaustion that came from hours of fear and flight. A patrol car turned onto the street where she hid, its spotlight painting white circles on snow-covered lawns. Maggie pressed herself lower, feeling the cold seep through her borrowed clothes. The car moved past, but she knew they'd be back. They'd search every yard, every hiding spot, until they found the crazy pregnant lady who thought she'd lost 5 children that never existed. But Emma's initials were real. The carved letters had felt solid under her fingertips, worn but undeniable. Whatever else they'd erased, they hadn't thought to search 30-year-old pine trees for evidence. As the patrol car's taillights disappeared around a corner, Maggie forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't stay hidden behind mailboxes forever. She needed help, real help, not the institutional kind that came with restraints and medications. The house beside her glowed with warm light from its windows. Through the glass, she could see a Christmas tree decorated with handmade ornaments, the kind children crafted in school with construction paper and glitter. A family lived here, maybe a family with memories that went back far enough to matter. Maggie approached the front door on unsteady legs, each step a decision to trust strangers with her freedom. The doorbell played a cheerful electronic tune that seemed to mock her desperation. After what felt like hours, the door opened to reveal a woman in her 60s, grey-haired and wearing a holiday sweater covered in dancing reindeer. "Oh my," the woman said, taking in Maggie's disheveled appearance, the oversized coat, the exhaustion written across her features. "Are you all right, dear? I need help." The words came out cracked and desperate. "Please. I know how this looks, but I'm not dangerous. I just need someone to listen." The woman, Ruth, according to the name embroidered on her sweater, glanced nervously over Maggie's shoulder toward the street. "Are you the woman they're looking for? The police came by an hour ago, said there was an escaped patient." "Yes." Maggie placed her hand protectively over her belly. "But I'm not sick, not the way they think. I had children once, 5 children, and something happened to them, something that people want me to forget." Ruth's expression shifted from concern to the familiar wariness Maggie knew so well. The careful distance people maintained from obvious mental illness. "Dear, perhaps you should let the doctors help you. Being pregnant alone like this, it can't be good for—" "How long have you lived here?" Maggie interrupted, desperation making her voice sharp. "In this neighborhood, I mean. Were you here in the early 90s? "We moved here in 1989, Ruth said slowly, her hand still gripping the door handle. "My husband got transferred, and we wanted a good school district for our daughter. Then you might remember. The Chen family. We lived on Elm Street, in the big Victorian house with the wraparound porch. I had 5 children, Emma, Rebecca, twins Lucas and Lily, and baby Samuel. Emma would have been 8 in 1993, with long black hair and these serious dark eyes. She was always reading. "I'm sorry," Ruth said, but something flickered across her face, a hesitation that wasn't quite the blank incomprehension Maggie had faced at the school. "I don't recall any family by that name." But her voice carried a note of uncertainty, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Maggie. It was the first crack Maggie had found in the wall of absolute denial that surrounded her children's existence. "You do remember something," Maggie pressed, stepping closer. "I can see it in your eyes. Please, I know how this sounds, but my children were real. They went to school here, they played in these streets." Ruth's eyes darted past Maggie again, and this time her face went pale. "You need to go. Now, they're coming back." Maggie turned to see another patrol car rounding the corner, its spotlight already sweeping toward Ruth's house. But as she prepared to run again, Ruth grabbed her arm with surprising strength. "The old pharmacy," Ruth whispered urgently. "On Maple Street, 3 blocks east. It's been closed for years, but Herb Costello still goes there sometimes. He ran it for 40 years, knew everyone in town, kept all the old prescription records." Her grip tightened. If your children existed, he would remember treating them. The spotlight was getting closer. Maggie squeezed Ruth's hand, a gesture of gratitude she couldn't voice, then melted back into the shadows between houses as the patrol car approached. But for the first time since escaping Riverside, she had more than desperate hope. She had a lead. The old pharmacy on Maple Street squatted between a vacant storefront and a coffee shop that hadn't been there in 1993, its faded sign barely readable in the pale afternoon light. Maggie crouched behind a snow-covered hedge across the street, studying the building that might hold the key to everything. The windows were dark, covered with yellowing newspaper from the inside, and a rusty chain secured the front door. But Ruth had said Herb Costello still came here sometimes. That somewhere in this abandoned building lay 40 years of prescription records, including, possibly, evidence that her children had once needed antibiotics for strep throat, inhalers for asthma, the everyday medications that proved a family had existed. Sirens echoed from several blocks away, a coordinated search pattern closing in. They'd found her trail again, or maybe they were simply being thorough, knowing she couldn't have gotten far on foot while 6 months pregnant. Every minute she spent observing increased the risk of discovery, but approaching the pharmacy too directly could be walking into a trap. The baby pressed against her ribs, making breathing difficult. Maggie shifted position, trying to ease the pressure, and felt a warm trickle between her legs. "Please no," she thought desperately. "Not now. Not when I'm this close." But when she checked, it was only urine. Her bladder finally surrendering to hours of stress and the baby's relentless pressure. The warm wetness quickly turned cold in the December air. Another layer of discomfort and humiliation. At Riverside, such accidents were handled with quiet efficiency by staff who'd seen worse. Here, she had no one but herself. A movement in the pharmacy's upstairs window caught her attention. A brief flash of light, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. But as she watched, she saw it again. Definitely a flashlight beam moving behind the newspaper-covered glass. Someone was inside. Maggie weighed her options. She could wait, hoping whoever it was would emerge, and prove to be the helpful Herb Costello Ruth had described. Or she could approach directly, gambling that her desperation would overcome his natural caution about a clearly unstable pregnant woman. The sound of engines grew closer. Through the gaps between buildings, she could see the sweep of searchlights, hear the crackle of radio communications. They were systematically searching every street now, probably bringing in additional units from neighboring towns. Soon they'd have dogs, and no amount of desperation could outrun a trained tracking animal. The baby kicked hard, as if sensing her indecision. The movement was so sharp that Maggie gasped aloud, her hand flying to her belly. For a moment, the world grayed at the edges, and she fought against the dizziness that threatened to topple her into the snow. When her vision cleared, an elderly man stood in the pharmacy's doorway, staring directly at her hiding spot. He was thin and stooped, wearing a heavy coat over what looked like pajamas, and his white hair caught the streetlight like dandelion seeds. Their eyes met across the empty street, and Maggie saw not fear or confusion, but something that looked almost like recognition. He raised one hand, not quite a wave but an acknowledgement, then stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. An invitation or a trap, she couldn't tell which. Maggie struggled to her feet, every muscle protesting. The wet fabric of her pants chafed against her thighs, and the baby's weight made her lower back scream with each movement. But Herb Costello, if that's who he was, might be her last chance before the search teams converged on this area. She crossed the street as quickly as her condition allowed, glancing constantly over her shoulder for patrol cars. The pharmacy door opened before she could knock, and the old man stepped aside to let her enter. "Herb," she whispered. He nodded, closing the door behind her and sliding a chain lock into place. You're the woman they're looking for. The one who thinks she had children here. The interior of the pharmacy was a time capsule, dust-covered shelves still lined with expired medications and forgotten health aids. Herb's flashlight provided the only illumination, casting wild shadows on walls covered with faded health posters and pharmacy school certificates. "I don't think," Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I know. My children were real, Mr. Costello. Emma, Rebecca, the twins Lucas and Lily, baby Samuel. They were my patients. You filled their prescriptions, treated their childhood illnesses." Herb studied her face in the flashlight's glow, and Maggie saw something in his expression that hadn't been there in anyone else she'd encountered. Not dismissal or pity, but careful consideration, as if he were weighing what he knew against what he'd been told to forget. Outside, the first patrol car turned onto Maple Street, its searchlight beginning its systematic sweep of storefronts. "Come," Herb said quietly, leading her toward a door marked "Private" at the back of the store. "We need to talk, and we don't have much time. But first, I need to know. Are you prepared to learn the truth about what happened to your family? Because once you know, there's no going back to the safety of not remembering." Maggie's hand trembled on her belly as she stared into Herb's weathered face. The baby kicked frantically, as if sensing the weight of his words. "The safety of not remembering?" she whispered. "There is no safety. There's only 30 years of being told I'm insane while my children are missing." Herb's flashlight beam wavered, casting their shadows in a macabre dance across pharmaceutical bottles that would never again heal anyone. Outside, the patrol car's searchlight swept closer, its engine idling just beyond the storefront windows. "Then God help us both," Herb said, pushing open the door to his private office. "Because what I'm about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about your life." The back room was smaller than a closet, cramped with filing cabinets that reached the ceiling. The air smelled of old paper and something else, something medicinal that made Maggie's stomach lurch. Herb pulled a key from around his neck and unlocked the bottom drawer of the nearest cabinet. "I kept records they told me to destroy," he said, his arthritic fingers working through manila folders. 40 years of prescriptions, insurance claims, vaccination records. I told myself it was for legal protection, but really—" He looked up at her, and his eyes were haunted. "Really, I knew something was wrong. The way people forgot, the way whole families just vanished from memory." Maggie sank into the room's only chair, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The baby had gone still, a sudden absence of movement that terrified her more than its previous agitation. "You remember them?" "I remember fragments, pieces that don't quite fit together anymore." Herb's hand stopped on a thick folder near the back. "Your daughter Emma, serious little thing, always asked how the medicine worked. Ear infections mostly, and that persistent cough one winter." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. Someone else remembered Emma's cough. The way she'd explain antibiotics to her stuffed animals as if they were her patients. "You do remember. You actually remember her. And the twins," Herb continued, pulling out the folder with shaking hands. "Lucas broke his arm that summer, fell off his bike trying to keep up with the older kids. Lily was allergic to amoxicillin. We had to find alternatives twice." He opened the folder, revealing pages of handwritten prescription logs. "They were real, Maggie. Your children were absolutely real." The patrol car's engine grew louder, stopping directly outside. Radio chatter filtered through the walls, voices coordinating search patterns. But Maggie couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The evidence lay spread before her. Dates, dosages, her children's names in Herb's careful pharmacist's script. Then what happened to them? The question came out as a sob. If they were real, where did they go? Why doesn't anyone else remember? Herb's face had gone ashen in the flashlight's glow. He pulled out another folder, this one thicker, marked with official government stamps. Because someone made them disappear. Not just physically, from reality itself. From memory, from records, from every trace that they'd ever existed. He opened the second folder, revealing documents that made no sense to Maggie's trained medical mind. Chemical formulas, testing protocols, lists of patient numbers instead of names. Cognitive restructuring initiative, she read aloud from a letterhead. Memory modification program. What is this? Experimental drug trials, Herb said, his voice barely a whisper. Riverside wasn't just a psychiatric hospital. It was a testing facility. They were developing compounds that could selectively erase memories, specific events, entire relationships, whole categories of experience. The baby suddenly kicked so hard that Maggie cried out, doubling over in pain. But it wasn't the physical sensation that devastated her. It was the understanding flooding through her mind like poison. They tested it on me. On everyone who might remember your family. Neighbors, teachers, other parents, shopkeepers, anyone who'd had contact with you or the children. Herb's hands shook as he turned pages of test subject lists. The fire at your house wasn't an accident, Maggie. It was a cover story. They took your children, then systematically erased them from every mind that had known them. Outside, car doors slammed. Voices shouted orders. Boots crunched through snow. The search team had arrived in force, surrounding the building. But why? Maggie's voice broke completely. Why would anyone do this to children, to families? Herb was already moving, shoving documents into a plastic bag. Because your husband wasn't who you thought he was. David Chen was a researcher for Meridian Pharmaceuticals, one of the lead developers of the memory modification drugs, and when he tried to stop the program, tried to expose what they were doing to human test subjects, he pressed the bag into her hands. They made him disappear too, made everyone forget he'd ever existed. The front door exploded inward. Flashlight beams stabbed through the darkness, followed by shouts of "Clear the building." And subject is inside. Maggie clutched the evidence to her chest. 30 years of questions finally answered in the worst possible way. Her children hadn't died in some accident she couldn't remember. They'd been stolen, weaponized, used as leverage against a father who'd grown a conscience, and she'd been left alive to suffer, her memories scrambled but not completely erased, a living experiment in selective amnesia. The truth was more devastating than any delusion could ever be. Heavy boots thundered through the pharmacy's main floor as Maggie pressed herself against the filing cabinet, the evidence bag crushed to her chest. The baby had gone completely still, an unnatural quiet that sent ice through her veins even as flashlight beams swept under the office door. "There's a back room," a voice called out. "Door's locked from the inside." Herb grabbed her arm with surprising strength for his age. "The window," he whispered, pointing to a narrow opening near the ceiling, barely wide enough for a child. "It leads to the alley." Maggie stared at the impossible escape route, then down at her swollen belly. 6 months pregnant, exhausted, and now carrying the weight of a truth so monstrous, it felt like it might crush her from the inside. "I can't fit through that." The office door shuddered as someone threw their weight against it. The old lock wouldn't hold much longer. "Then we make our stand here," Herb said, but his voice carried the resignation of a man who knew they were already beaten. "At least you have the proof now. At least you know." The door splintered inward, and suddenly the tiny room flooded with blinding light and shouting voices. Hands seized Maggie's arms, professional and implacable, while someone kicked the scattered prescription records across the floor. The plastic bag was ripped from her grasp before she could even think to resist. "Maggie Chen," said a voice she recognized. Dr. Reeves, her psychiatrist from Riverside. He stood in the doorway like a figure from her nightmares, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something harder, more urgent. "You've led us quite a chase." "You lying bastard," she gasped, struggling against the orderlies holding her. "You knew. You've known all along what happened to my children." Dr. Reeves's expression didn't change as he gestured to the evidence being collected by men in dark suits, men who definitely weren't hospital security. "Mr. Costello, I'm disappointed. We had an arrangement." Herb straightened despite his age, meeting the doctor's gaze with defiant dignity. 40 years I kept your secrets. 40 years of watching families disappear while I pretended not to remember. But seeing her, He looked at Maggie with something like reverence. "Seeing what you did to her, what you took from her, I couldn't anymore." One of the suited men held up the bag of documents. "Everything's here, Doctor. Prescription records, testing protocols, the Meridian files." Costello kept copies of everything. The words hit Maggie like physical blows. Not just the confirmation of the conspiracy, but the casual way they discussed it, as if her children were nothing more than data points in some vast experiment. "Where are they?" she screamed, the sound tearing her throat raw. "Where are Emma and Rebecca and my babies?" Dr. Reeves knelt beside her, his voice returning to that familiar, patronizing tone she'd heard for 30 years. "Maggie, you're having another episode. The stress of the escape, the pregnancy hormones, they're making you confused again. There never were any children." But something had changed in his eyes. The absolute certainty was gone, replaced by the careful performance of a man following a script. He knew she knew, and the pretense felt obscene. "The records prove," she began, but he was already shaking his head. "The records prove that Mr. Costello has been enabling your delusions for years, creating false documentation to feed your fantasies. It's tragic, really, how your mental illness has contaminated even well-meaning people in the community." Maggie watched in horror as the suited men began feeding Herb's carefully preserved files into a portable shredder they'd brought for exactly this purpose. 30 years of proof, her children's medical histories, vaccination records, the evidence that they had existed, disappearing into metal teeth with mechanical efficiency. "Stop," she sobbed, trying to lunge toward the machine. "Please, those are the only proof I have left." The sedative needle slid into her arm before she saw it coming, Dr. Reeves's familiar ritual of chemical compliance. But this time felt different, not the usual antipsychotics, but something stronger. Something that made the world blur at the edges almost immediately. "The pregnancy," she mumbled, her tongue already thick and uncooperative. "The baby will be fine," Dr. Reeves assured her, but his tone was disturbingly clinical. "In fact, we're very interested in studying the neurochemical effects of gestation on memory formation. Your child will contribute valuable data to our research." The words penetrated through the gathering fog in her mind, bringing with them a terror so absolute it felt like drowning. They weren't just going to erase her children's existence again, they were planning to use her unborn baby as another test subject. As consciousness slipped away, Maggie saw Herb being led away in handcuffs, his 40 years of careful record-keeping reduced to confetti on the pharmacy floor. The last of the evidence had been destroyed, the final witness silenced. Her children were lost to her again, and this time she might lose another one before it was even born. All seemed lost. The darkness behind Maggie's eyelids wasn't the gentle fade of natural sleep. It was chemical, imposed, a forced surrender that her mind fought even as her body went limp. But somewhere in that artificial void, something extraordinary happened. The drug meant to silence her memories instead stripped away 30 years of carefully constructed barriers, and suddenly she could see everything with crystalline clarity. She wasn't pregnant. The revelation hit her like ice water, shocking and undeniable. Her hands, numb from the sedative, couldn't feel the belly she'd been carrying for months, couldn't sense the baby whose kicks had guided her through this desperate journey. The pregnancy, her impossible, miraculous sixth child, was another implanted memory, another layer of the experiment designed to keep her compliant and confused. But if that was false, what else had they twisted? Through the drug-induced paralysis, memories began reassembling themselves like scattered photographs suddenly reorganized. Not the fractured, painful glimpses she'd lived with for 30 years, but complete sequential truth. She saw herself at 22, not as a psychiatric patient, but as a research assistant at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, working alongside her husband David on cognitive enhancement studies that had somehow morphed into something monstrous. She remembered the night David came home shaking, his face pale with horror. "They're not just testing memory enhancement anymore, Maggie. They're developing selective erasure protocols, and they're using children, orphans, foster kids nobody would miss, as test subjects, the children." Oh God, the children. Emma, Rebecca, Lucas, Lily, Samuel. They hadn't been her biological children at all. They were the test subjects David had tried to protect, 5 kids between the ages of 3 and 15 who'd been subjected to experimental memory modification drugs. When David threatened to expose Meridian's illegal human trials, they'd planned to eliminate all the evidence, including the children themselves. But David and Maggie had gotten there first. The night of the fire, it all came flooding back now, each detail sharp as broken glass. They'd broken into the Meridian facility where the children were being held, planning to rescue them and flee the country with evidence of the company's crimes. But something had gone wrong. Security had been waiting. In the chaos, David had been shot, and Maggie had watched him die while trying to shield the children from the gunfire. That's when Dr. Reeves had made his offer, the deal that had destroyed her life so completely she'd forgotten it ever existed. "We can make this all go away, Mrs. Chen. Your husband's death, your involvement in the break-in, your knowledge of our research, but in exchange, you become our long-term study subject. We need to understand the effects of sustained memory modification, and you're perfect, young, healthy, with strong maternal instincts that will make the implanted family memories feel real." She'd agreed to save the children's lives. 5 scared kids who would be quietly relocated and given new identities, their own memories carefully adjusted so they could live normal lives without the trauma of what had been done to them. The price was her sanity, her freedom, and 30 years of believing she was a delusional mother whose children had never existed. But now, as the latest round of drugs coursed through her system, Maggie realized the most horrifying truth of all. They'd never intended to keep their promise. The pregnancy had been their latest test, a way to study how maternal hormones affected the stability of implanted memories. But more than that, it was a delivery mechanism. They needed her to produce another child, another test subject they could experiment on from birth. The baby she thought she was carrying wasn't real yet, but it was meant to be. They planned to impregnate her artificially while she was sedated, using her as an unwilling incubator for their next generation of research. Through the haze of paralysis, she heard Dr. Reeves speaking to someone in the room. "The hormonal therapy should begin immediately. We'll need her pregnant within the next cycle if we want to maintain the delusion's integrity. The synthetic pregnancy symptoms have served their purpose, but we need biological reality now." Another voice, clinical and detached. "What about the Costello problem? His records could surface again." "Mr. Costello won't be a problem much longer. Memory modification at his age carries significant risks. We may lose him entirely in the process. As for his records, we'll ensure any remaining copies are comprehensively destroyed." They were going to kill Herb, erase his mind so completely that he'd become a vegetable, just to protect their secret. And somewhere out there, if they were even still alive, 5 children who'd once depended on her protection were living lives built on manufactured memories, never knowing how close they'd come to dying for a pharmaceutical company's ambitions. The sedative pulled her deeper, but now Maggie fought it with everything she had. She'd spent 30 years as their unwilling test subject, but she finally knew the truth. The children were real. David's sacrifice had meant something. And somehow, against impossible odds, she had to find a way to expose what Meridian had done before they created another generation of victims. The revelation changed everything, including her understanding of what she was truly fighting for, gathering strength. Maggie let the sedative carry her deeper into unconsciousness, but this time it wasn't surrender, it was strategy. For 30 years she'd fought against the drugs, clawing her way back to a false reality they'd constructed for her. Now she understood that resistance itself had been part of their design, keeping her mind active enough to process new implanted memories while never quite breaking free of their control. But knowledge was power, even in this sterile prison. She catalogued every sound filtering through her chemically induced paralysis. The soft beeping of monitoring equipment, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the distant hum of ventilation systems. Dr. Reeves's voice faded as he left the room, replaced by the gentler movements of nursing staff conducting routine checks. They believed her completely unconscious, a mistake born of 3 decades of successful control. The 4-drip feeding into her arm carried more than sedatives. She could taste the metallic bite of hormonal suppressants, the bitter chemical tang of memory inhibitors, and something new, a compound that made her skin feel hypersensitive, as if every nerve ending had been stripped raw. Preparation for the artificial insemination they'd discussed, her body being primed like a laboratory specimen. Rage flooded through her, pure and cleansing, not the confused, desperate anger of a woman chasing ghosts, but the focused fury of someone who finally understood the scope of what had been stolen from her. They hadn't just taken 30 years of her life, they'd weaponized her maternal instincts, turned her capacity for love into a tool for their experiments. But they'd made one crucial error. In their arrogance, they'd revealed too much in front of what they assumed was an unconscious patient. She now knew that Herb Costello was scheduled for memory modification, which meant he was still alive, still a threat to them. And if they were worried about his record surfacing again, it meant copies existed somewhere beyond the pharmacy they'd just destroyed. The nursing shift changed at 11 p.m. Maggie had memorized the hospital's routines years ago, counting time by the rhythm of institutional care. The night staff was smaller, more relaxed, focused on maintaining rather than monitoring. It was her best chance. She began testing the limits of her paralysis, starting with tiny movements they couldn't detect through their equipment. A finger twitch, a slight shift of her jaw. The drugs were powerful but not absolute. Her body was metabolizing them faster than they'd calculated, perhaps because of the synthetic hormones they'd been feeding her for months. By midnight, she could move her eyes beneath closed lids. By 1 a.m., she had enough control over her breathing to appear stable, while actually hyperventilating enough to clear more of the sedatives from her system. The monitors registered normal sleep patterns, their sophisticated sensors fooled by techniques she'd learned from David's research into consciousness studies decades ago. At 2 a.m., she opened her eyes. The room was dimmer than she'd expected, lit only by the green glow of medical equipment and light seeping under the door from the hallway. She was alone, the first time in years they'd left her unobserved while conscious. They really did believe their chemicals had rendered her harmless. Maggie sat up slowly, fighting waves of nausea as the remaining drugs protested her movements. Her body felt foreign after the false pregnancy, simultaneously lighter and weaker than she'd expected. But her mind was clearer than it had been in 3 decades, sharp with purpose and terrible understanding. The 4-port in her arm came out with practiced ease, 30 years of medical training never fully erased. Blood welled from the insertion site, but she ignored it, moving to the small closet where they'd stored her clothes. Not the hospital gown that marked her as a patient, but the winter coat and boots that had carried her through her first escape attempt. She was going to break out again. But this time, she wasn't chasing the ghosts of children who'd never existed. She was going to find 5 young people who would now be adults, living lives built on manufactured memories, and somehow find a way to prove to them and to the world what Meridian Pharmaceuticals had done. The computer terminal in her room was logged into the hospital's main system, another oversight born of overconfidence. Maggie's fingers flew over the keyboard, muscle memory guiding her through medical databases she'd once known intimately. Patient transfer records, discharge summaries, staff schedules, and there, buried in administrative files, Herb Costello's admission paperwork. He was 3 floors down in the secure wing, scheduled for experimental cognitive therapy at 8 a.m. She had 6 hours to reach him, and together they might be able to piece together enough evidence to expose the truth. But first, she needed to understand exactly what they planned to do to her. The hormonal therapy schedule was detailed in her medical files, a cocktail of fertility drugs and memory suppressants designed to make her compliant during artificial insemination. They weren't just planning to give her a child, they were going to make her forget the process entirely, believe the pregnancy was natural and desired. The same violation they'd perpetrated for 30 years, now extended to the next generation. Maggie deleted her medical files from the system and erased the computer's log of her access. Let them wonder how much she'd learned. Then she moved to the door, 30 years of institutional living having taught her exactly how to navigate a hospital without triggering alarms. She had work to do, allies to gather, and a truth to uncover that could bring down one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world. The hunt for her children, her real children, the 5 victims she'd failed to protect, was about to begin. The hospital corridors at 3 a.m. carried a different energy than during daylight hours. Quieter, but somehow more intense, as if the darkness concentrated all the pain and hope within those walls into something Maggie could almost taste. She moved through the shadows with purpose born of desperation, 30 years of institutional knowledge guiding her past security checkpoints and around nurse stations with surgical precision. The secure wing access required a key card, but Maggie had spent decades watching staff routines. The night orderly always propped the door open during his smoke breaks, a small rebellion against hospital policy that would now serve her cause. She slipped through the gap like smoke, her heart hammering against her ribs as she navigated toward Herb Costello's room. She found him awake, staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of someone who'd spent too many nights contemplating mortality. When he saw her, his eyes widened, not with surprise, but with something like relief. "I wondered if you'd come," he whispered, struggling to sit up despite the restraints binding his wrists to the bed rails. "Thought they might have finished what they started with you." They tried. Maggie worked at his restraints with fingers that remembered every knot and buckle from her nursing days. But they made the mistake of thinking I was still the broken woman they've been controlling for 30 years. You remember now. Everything. It wasn't a question. Somehow, this old man who'd risked everything to help her could see the change in her face, the transformation from victim to warrior. David, the real children, Meridian's experiments, all of it. Herb nodded grimly as the restraints fell away. "I kept hoping you'd break through on your own. 40 years I've been waiting for someone strong enough to expose what they did." He rubbed circulation back into his wrists, his movements slow but determined. "The records they destroyed at the pharmacy, those were just copies. The originals are hidden somewhere they'll never find them. Where?" Maggie helped him stand, surprised by how steady he was despite his age and circumstances. "Safety deposit box. Registered under my sister's maiden name in Hartford. She died 20 years ago, but the account's still active. Medical files, photographs, financial records showing Meridian's payments to hospital staff. Everything we need to prove the conspiracy." Hope flared in Maggie's chest, bright and dangerous. "Then we can—" "Not we," Herb interrupted gently. "They're going to lobotomize me at 8 a.m., Margaret. Experimental cognitive therapy is just their euphemism for turning my brain into mush. You're going on alone." The words hit her like physical blows. After 30 years of isolation, she'd found one ally who knew the truth, and now she was going to lose him too. "There has to be another way. We could both escape, go to the authorities together. Look at me, child." Herb's voice carried the weight of someone who'd already made peace with the inevitable. "I'm 78 years old with a heart condition. I wouldn't make it 3 blocks in this weather, and they'd catch us both before we could reach anyone who'd listen. But you're strong. You've survived 30 years of their worst, and now you know what you're fighting for." He reached into his hospital gown and pulled out a small key, brass worn smooth by decades of handling. "Box 247 at First National in Hartford. Everything you need is there, including something else, addresses." Maggie's breath caught. "The children?" "I never stopped tracking them. 5 kids who vanished from the system the same night David Chen died. 5 new identities that appeared in different states within weeks. They're adults now. Emma's a teacher in Oregon. Rebecca works for a non-profit in Denver. The twins are in California, and Samuel—" Herb's voice softened. "Samuel's a pediatric nurse in Boston. Chose the same profession you did, like something in his modified memories called him to healing." Tears burned Maggie's eyes as she clutched the key. Her children, David's children, the 5 souls they'd died trying to protect. They were alive. They'd built lives, found purposes, become the people they were meant to be despite everything Meridian had done to them. "They won't remember you," Herb warned. "Their memories were altered too thoroughly for that. But maybe, if you can prove what was done to all of you, maybe there's a way to help them understand." Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, the measured pace of security making rounds. Maggie pressed the key into her palm until its edges bit deep enough to draw blood, a talisman of purpose that would guide her through whatever came next. "I won't let them erase you," she whispered to Herb. "You already saved me," he replied. 40 years I've carried this secret, and now it belongs to someone who can actually do something with it. That's enough." The final confrontation was coming. Not just with Dr. Reeves or Meridian Pharmaceuticals, but with 30 years of systematic psychological torture that had stolen her life and 5 innocent childhoods. But now she had what she needed: proof, addresses, and the absolute certainty that she would finish what David had started, no matter what it cost her. The hunt was about to begin in earnest. The footsteps in the corridor grew louder, accompanied by the static crackle of a security radio. Maggie's muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at her to run, but Herb's weathered hand closed over hers with surprising strength. "Wait," he breathed, his eyes suddenly sharp with urgency. "There's something else. Something I should have told you first." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The pregnancy, it's not just synthetic hormones anymore, Margaret. They succeeded. You're actually carrying a child." The world tilted sideways. Maggie's free hand moved instinctively to her abdomen, where the familiar swell she'd assumed was chemically induced suddenly felt horrifyingly real. "That's impossible. I would have known." "They've been sedating you during procedures for weeks. The hormonal therapy wasn't preparation. It was maintenance. You're 6 months along with a child conceived in a laboratory, carrying genetic material from," his voice cracked, "from David. They preserved samples from his autopsy 30 years ago." The revelation hit her like ice water, every carefully constructed wall of determination threatening to crumble. They hadn't just stolen her past, they'd violated her body to create a future she never consented to, using her dead husband's DNA to grow their next test subject. The child moving inside her wasn't just hers, it was David's ghost made flesh, an innocent life designed to be tortured from birth. "The research files in Hartford," Herb continued urgently, "they detail everything. Project Genesis, Meridian's plan to create a generation of children with artificially modified brain chemistry. Your baby is the prototype." Security voices echoed closer now, discussing shift changes and medication schedules. Maggie forced herself to think through the horror, to transform revulsion into fuel for what had to come next. The child inside her was real, innocent, and already targeted for a lifetime of experimentation. But that also meant she was carrying living proof of Meridian's crimes, DNA evidence that could expose everything if she could keep them both alive long enough. "The other children," she whispered. "Do any of them have... Were there other pregnancies?" Herb's expression darkened. "Rebecca had a daughter 3 years ago. Little girl named Sophie. Rebecca thinks it was a normal pregnancy, but the medical records show fertility treatments she doesn't remember receiving. The child exhibits unusual cognitive development, accelerated learning, but also severe anxiety disorders that require constant medication. Another generation." They hadn't stopped with the 5 children Maggie and David had tried to save. They were still hunting their victims' offspring, still weaving their web of manipulation and control through carefully orchestrated medical interventions. How many other families had been touched by Meridian's experiments? How many modified memories, artificial pregnancies, and stolen childhoods? The security team was 2 doors away. Maggie could hear them checking rooms, their routine becoming less routine as they approached Herb's room. In minutes, they would discover his empty restraints and sound-building-wide alarms. "I need to get you out of here," she said, helping Herb toward the window. But he resisted, settling back into the bed with grim finality. "No, child. Listen to me." His voice carried the authority of someone delivering final orders. "If I disappear tonight, they'll know you have the key. They'll change everything, move the evidence, relocate your children, disappear completely, but if they find me here in the morning, still scheduled for the procedure, they'll think their secret is safe a little longer. They'll destroy your mind. Maybe. Or maybe that old heart of mine will give out before they get the chance. Either way, you'll have a head start." He pressed something else into her hand, a small photograph, edges worn soft with age. "That's the 5 of them, taken the day before the fire. David managed to get one picture before everything went wrong." Maggie looked down at 5 young faces. Emma's serious eyes, Rebecca's defiant smile, the twins' identical mischievous grins, baby Samuel sleeping peacefully in David's arms. Her family. The people she'd forgotten for 30 years, now adults living fabricated lives they believed were real. The security team reached the door next to theirs. Radio chatter filled the hallway as they verified occupancy and moved on. 30 seconds, maybe less. The basement maintenance tunnels connect to the parking garage. Herb whispered rapidly. "Utility room 3 doors down. Ladder behind the water heater. Your car keys are in your personal effects, but they've probably disabled the vehicle. Take mine, blue Honda in spot C47. Keys under the rear wheel well. 20 seconds. Find them, Margaret. Find your children and Sophie, gather the evidence, and burn Meridian to the ground. But whatever you do, protect that baby. It's the only proof that can't be altered or destroyed." 10 seconds. Maggie squeezed his hand one final time, memorizing the face of the man who'd given her back her life and her purpose. Then she moved to the window as the security team's voices reached Herb's door. The final test wasn't just beginning. It was already here, demanding everything she'd learned about survival, motherhood, and the terrible price of truth. The window lock yielded to Maggie's desperate fingers, just as the security team's voices reached Herb's door. Behind her, she heard him arranging himself on the bed, muffling the sound of her escape with a theatrical cough. The winter air hit her like a slap as she squeezed through the narrow opening, 6 months of pregnancy making the maneuver nearly impossible, but desperation lending her strength she didn't know she possessed. The utility room was exactly where Herb had promised. Maggie dropped through the maintenance hatch into darkness that smelled of machine oil and decades of institutional neglect. Above her, alarms began wailing. They'd found Herb's loosened restraints, discovered her empty room. The building erupted into coordinated chaos, but she was already moving through tunnels that connected to the parking garage, like arteries in a concrete heart. Herb's Honda started on the first try. Keys exactly where he'd promised. Maggie pulled out of the garage as security vehicles converged on the main hospital entrances, their occupants focused on perimeters rather than routine departures. She forced herself to drive normally, to breathe steadily, to think beyond the immediate terror clawing at her chest. The baby moved inside her, David's child, their child, conceived through violation but innocent of the sins that had created it. Every flutter was both miracle and weapon, proof of Meridian's crimes wrapped in flesh she would die to protect. The company had made one fatal mistake. They'd given her something even more powerful than vengeance to fight for. Hartford was 90 minutes away through snow-covered highways that glistened like knives under streetlights. Maggie drove through the pre-dawn darkness with single-minded focus, the photograph of her 5 children propped against the dashboard like a shrine. Emma, Rebecca, Lucas, Lily, Samuel. Their faces had matured in her imagination, but their eyes would be the same. She would know them when she found them. The First National Bank wouldn't open until 9 a.m., giving her 3 hours to plan her next moves. But as she reached the outskirts of Hartford, her rearview mirror filled with headlights that had been following her for the past 10 miles. Black SUVs with government plates, their occupants invisible behind tinted glass. Meridian had found her already. Maggie's hands tightened on the steering wheel as the vehicles closed distance, their coordinated movement, speaking of professional pursuit teams and resources that dwarfed anything she could muster alone. But she'd learned something crucial during 30 years of captivity. Sometimes the only way to win was to refuse to play by their rules. She yanked the wheel hard right, sending the Honda skidding into a shopping center parking lot still slick with ice. The SUVs followed, their drivers skilled but not expecting their quarry to stop running and start fighting. Maggie slammed the car into park and stepped out into the freezing air, her pregnant silhouette stark against the snow. Margaret Chen. The voice belonged to Dr. Reeves, emerging from the lead vehicle with the confident stride of someone accustomed to complete control. You've led us quite a chase, but this ends now. Does it? Maggie's voice carried across the empty parking lot with 30 years of suppressed fury behind it. I know everything, Doctor. The experiments, the false memories, the children you stole and scattered across the country, the pregnancies you've been forcing on victims for decades. Reeves paused, perhaps surprised by her coherence, her clarity. Behind him, a team of orderlies emerged from the other vehicles, medical restraints and sedation equipment visible in their hands. They'd come prepared to take her back to the hospital, to continue the cycle of violation and control. You know fragments, Reeves corrected. Disconnected pieces fed to you by a delusional old man. Come with us quietly and we can help you separate reality from the fantasies your damaged mind has constructed. Like you helped my 5 children separate reality from the lives you stole from them. Maggie stepped forward, her movement triggering an immediate response from the orderlies. Like you helped David separate reality from the bullet you put in his head when he tried to expose you? For the first time, genuine surprise flickered across Reeves' face. David Chen committed suicide, Margaret. The investigation was thorough. David Chen was murdered because he discovered Project Genesis 30 years too early. Maggie's hand moved to her abdomen, where the baby kicked as if responding to her father's name. But you made one mistake, Doctor. You let him live long enough to hide the evidence. The orderlies were moving now, closing the circle with practiced efficiency. But Maggie wasn't the same broken woman they'd controlled for 3 decades. She was a mother with nothing left to lose and 5 children to save, carrying proof of Meridian's crimes in her very body. The confrontation she'd been building toward for 30 years was finally here, and this time she was ready for war. The orderlies lunged forward in perfect synchronization, but Maggie was already moving. 30 years of forced sedation and restraint had taught her to recognize the microsecond before violence began, and pregnancy hadn't dulled those survival instincts. It had sharpened them to a razor's edge. She grabbed the nearest orderly's arm as he reached for her, using his momentum to send him sprawling across the ice-slicked asphalt. The sedative syringe skittered away into the darkness, useless. But there were 6 more closing in, and even with desperation fueling her strength, she couldn't fight them all. Stop! The voice that cut through the chaos wasn't hers. It belonged to a young woman emerging from behind the SUVs, her face pale but determined in the harsh parking lot lights. Dr. Reeves, step away from her. Now. Maggie's breath caught. The woman was in her 30s with dark hair and serious eyes that belonged in a photograph worn soft by decades of desperate love. Emma, her eldest daughter. No longer the 8-year-old who'd disappeared 30 years ago, but unmistakably the same soul. Miss Hartford, Reeves said coldly, not taking his eyes off Maggie. You're supposed to be on a plane back to Oregon. Your involvement here is neither required nor welcomed. My involvement? Emma's voice shook with barely controlled fury. You've been feeding me false memories and experimental drugs for 30 years. Monitoring my every medical appointment, controlling my entire life. And now I find out the woman you've been torturing is my mother. Behind Emma, more figures emerged from the shadows. Rebecca, tall and fierce with David's stubborn jawline. The twins, Lucas and Lily, moving with identical protective instincts. And Samuel, gentle Samuel, who'd become a pediatric nurse just like Maggie once was, carrying healing in his hands despite everything they'd done to him. Her 5 children, alive, adult, and standing between her and her captors. How? Maggie whispered, her voice breaking on the single word. Herb Whitmore, Rebecca said grimly. He didn't just hide evidence. He's been tracking all of us for years, sending anonymous tips about our medical records, our strange memory gaps. It took us months to piece it together, but when we found each other—" She gestured to her siblings. "We found you too." The orderlies had stopped their advance, confused by this unexpected development. Reeves' face had gone ashen, his carefully orchestrated plan dissolving into chaos. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Modified memories, delusional episodes. No court would accept testimony from subjects who've undergone extensive psychiatric treatment. "Maybe not," Lucas said quietly, "but they'd accept DNA evidence from an impossible pregnancy. And financial records showing 30 years of illegal human experimentation." He held up a manila envelope, safety deposit box 247. "Herb gave us the duplicate key before his procedure this morning." The procedure. Maggie's heart clenched as she realized what that meant. Herb was gone, his mind destroyed to buy them this moment. The old man who'd risked everything to expose the truth had paid the ultimate price while her children gathered the evidence needed to finish what David had started. "The pregnancy," Emma said, her medical knowledge evident in her voice. "If they artificially created a child using preserved genetic material, that's assault. Forced medical procedures. Crimes that can't be explained away by claims of mental illness." Reeves was backing toward his vehicle, his orderlies following his retreat. But Maggie could see the calculation in his eyes, the same cold assessment that had cost David his life 30 years ago. They were witnesses now, all 6 of them. They knew too much to be allowed to live. "Run," she whispered, then louder. "All of you, run. He's not going to let us leave here alive." "We're not running anymore," Samuel said with quiet determination. "And we're not leaving you." He stepped closer to Maggie, close enough that she could see David's gentle strength in his face. "We've spent 30 years living half-lives with stolen memories. Whatever happens now, we face it together." The sound of additional vehicles approaching cut through the night. More black SUVs, more orderlies, enough firepower to eliminate 6 inconvenient witnesses and bury the truth for another generation. Meridian had unlimited resources and no conscience. They were 6 people with a manila envelope and 30 years of accumulated trauma. But they were also a family reunited, and Maggie finally understood the choice that lay before her. She could save her children by surrendering herself, returning to captivity to protect the 5 lives she'd fought so hard to find, or she could stand with them and risk losing everything in one final desperate gamble for freedom. The baby kicked inside her, David's child claiming its place in this moment of reckoning. The sacrifice wasn't just hers to make anymore. It belonged to all of them, together. Maggie reached for her children's hands as the reinforcements surrounded them, ready to pay whatever price victory demanded. The reinforcements never reached them. As the black SUVs converged on their position, the night exploded with flashing lights. But these belonged to Connecticut State Police, FBI vehicles, and news vans that poured into the parking lot like a carefully orchestrated symphony. The cavalry hadn't come from Meridian's ranks. It had come from the outside world that Herb Whitmore had spent his final hours contacting. "Federal agents!" The amplified voice cut through the chaos as armed figures emerged from unmarked vehicles. "Dr. Reeves, you and your team are under arrest for violations of federal civil rights statutes, illegal human experimentation, and conspiracy to commit murder." Maggie watched in stunned silence as the orderlies dropped their restraints and raised their hands, their faces reflecting the same bewilderment she felt. Reeves stood frozen beside his SUV, his expression cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, resignation. "The old man," Rebecca whispered, understanding first. "Herb didn't just gather evidence, he distributed it." Emma was crying, tears streaming down her face as she pulled out a smartphone. On the screen, news alerts were already breaking. Pharmaceutical giant accused of decades-long human experiments. Psychiatric patients subjected to illegal memory modification. Government oversight agencies launch criminal investigation. The evidence from the safety deposit box hadn't just been their insurance. It had been Herb's final gift to the world. Copies sent to every major news outlet, congressional oversight committee, and law enforcement agency with jurisdiction. While Meridian's attention focused on hunting down their escaped subjects, The truth had been spreading through channels they couldn't control or silence. Samuel's arms came around Maggie first, then Lucas and Lily joining the embrace. Rebecca and Emma completed the circle, 6 people who'd spent 30 years believing they were strangers suddenly, remembering what it felt like to be a family. The baby moved between them, David's legacy claiming its place among his children. "It's over," Maggie whispered, but even as she said it, she knew it wasn't that simple. The immediate threat had passed, but the aftermath stretched ahead like unexplored territory. 30 years of stolen memories couldn't be restored overnight. The psychological damage Meridian had inflicted would take years to heal, if it ever fully could. "The pregnancy," Emma said softly, her hand hovering over Maggie's abdomen. "The baby, it's really Dad's?" "Genetically, yes." Maggie's voice caught on the impossibility of it. "They preserved samples from his autopsy. Created this child without my consent, planning to use it for the next generation of experiments." She looked at each of her children's faces. "Your little sibling was supposed to be raised in a laboratory, never knowing love or family or anything beyond what they chose to program." Lucas's jaw tightened with David's stubborn anger. "But that's not going to happen." "No," Maggie agreed, feeling the baby kick as if responding to the promise. "It's not." The FBI agents were leading Reeves away in handcuffs, his corporate composure finally cracking as reporters shouted questions about Project Genesis and the estimated dozens of victims scattered across the country. Other families would be reunited, other stolen lives potentially restored, because an old man had refused to let the truth die with him. "There's going to be trials," Rebecca said practically, her voice carrying the strength that had once made her teenage defiance legendary. "Congressional hearings, media attention. They'll want us to testify, to relive everything." "We'll face it together," Samuel said, echoing his earlier words, but with a different weight now. Not desperate determination, but quiet certainty. "All of us." Maggie looked around the circle of her children, seeing David's features reflected in each face, alongside traits that were uniquely their own. They were strangers to each other in many ways, carrying 3 decades of manufactured experiences that would need to be carefully separated from authentic memories. The process would be painful, confusing, and incomplete, but they were alive, they were free, and they were family. A paramedic approached cautiously, medical bag in hand. "Ma'am, we need to check you and the baby. Hospital records indicate you've been missing prenatal care, and given your circumstances..." Maggie nodded, understanding. The child deserved proper medical attention, monitoring by doctors who saw it as a miracle to be protected, rather than an experiment to be exploited. She would need counseling, legal representation, and probably years of therapy to process what had been done to all of them. "We'll be right here," Emma promised as the paramedic guided Maggie toward an ambulance. "None of us are going anywhere." The snow had stopped falling, and dawn was breaking over Hartford, painting the chaos in shades of gold and hope. Maggie settled onto the gurney, feeling her children's presence like an anchor as the paramedic began his gentle examination. 30 years of captivity were ending. The rest of their lives, complicated, damaged, but undeniably real, was finally beginning. The return. 6 months later, Maggie stood in the doorway of the modest colonial house in suburban Hartford, watching her granddaughter take her first tentative steps across the living room. Baby Grace, named for the miracle she represented, wobbled between Emma's outstretched arms and the coffee table, her face bright with determination that reminded everyone achingly of David. "She's got Dad's stubborn streak," Rebecca observed from the couch, where she was helping Lucas sort through legal documents. The lawsuits against Meridian were proceeding slowly but inexorably, each deposition and court filing another nail in the corporation's coffin. Maggie smiled, her hand unconsciously moving to her now flat stomach. The birth had been difficult. 30 years of psychiatric medications had taken their toll. But Grace had emerged healthy and whole, unmarked by the circumstances of her conception. The doctors called her a medical miracle. Maggie simply called her David's final gift. "Speaking of stubborn," Samuel said, emerging from the kitchen with a tray of coffee. "Lily's threatening to hitchhike to Oregon if we don't finalize the house purchase by Friday." They were moving together, all 6 of them, plus Grace, to a sprawling farmhouse outside Portland where Lily had been living her manufactured life. It was neutral territory, free from the shadows of Hartford and Millbrook, a place where they could build authentic memories on clean ground. The insurance settlement from Meridian had made it possible, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what they'd lost. "I found something," Emma said suddenly, her voice tight with emotion. She was holding a photograph that had been tucked inside one of the legal files, faded and creased, but unmistakably genuine. "Look." Maggie took the picture with trembling fingers. It showed all 7 of them on Christmas morning, 1993, just weeks before their world had shattered. David was holding baby Samuel, while 8-year-old Emma supervised the twins opening presents. Rebecca rolled her eyes at the camera with teenage exasperation. And Maggie, young, unbroken Maggie, glowed with the contentment of a woman who believed her happiness was permanent. "Dr. Hartwell found it in David's old research files," Emma explained. Dr. Hartwell was the trauma specialist helping them navigate their recovery, separating real memories from Meridian's implants. He thought it might help with the memory reconstruction therapy. The photograph passed from hand to hand, each of them studying faces they barely remembered being. The process of reclaiming their past was like archaeological excavation, painstaking work that yielded fragments of truth buried beneath layers of artificial experiences. Some memories had been lost forever, probably destroyed when Meridian inserted their false histories. Others emerged gradually, triggered by scents or sounds or moments like this. "I remember that morning," Lily said wonderfully. "You made pancakes shaped like snowmen, and Lucas ate all the chocolate chips before they could melt." "I was saving them," Lucas protested, but his smile was soft with genuine recollection. These breakthrough moments were precious, proof that their authentic selves had survived 3 decades of psychological warfare. Maggie settled into David's old armchair, which they'd rescued from storage and reupholstered. Grace toddled over and raised her arms to be lifted, her baby babble filling the comfortable chaos of their rebuilt family. As Maggie held her youngest daughter, she marveled at how profoundly she'd changed since that desperate escape from Riverside. The fierce desperation that had driven her through those first terrifying days had evolved into something quieter, but no less powerful. She'd learned to trust again, trust her children, trust the legal system working to deliver justice, trust her own mind despite the gaps and uncertainties that might never fully heal. The hypervigilance remained, probably always would, but it no longer consumed her. "The reporters called again," Rebecca said, checking her phone. 60 Minutes wants to do a follow-up segment when the criminal trial starts. They'd become reluctant celebrities, the family that exposed one of the largest human rights violations in modern American history. Congressional hearings had led to new oversight regulations. Meridian had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate victims. Dr. Reeves and 17 other researchers faced federal charges. But for Maggie, the most meaningful victory was simpler: Sunday dinners around a table where no one monitored their conversations or documented their behavior. "We'll decide together," Maggie said, the phrase that had become their family motto. Every major choice was discussed, debated, and voted on, a conscious rejection of the helplessness Meridian had imposed on them. Samuel turned on the television for the evening news, and Grace clapped her hands at the bright colors and movement. She would grow up knowing the truth about her origins, but surrounded by love that was entirely authentic. No false memories, no manufactured emotions, just the complicated, beautiful reality of a family that had fought their way back to each other. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, but it no longer triggered panic. Winter meant Christmas morning chaos, sledding accidents that required bandages and hot chocolate, and bedtime stories told in voices that belonged completely to themselves. The woman who had escaped Riverside 6 months ago had been driven by desperate hope and righteous fury. The woman holding Grace Chen in a house full of children's laughter was something far more dangerous to those who trafficked in stolen lives. She was free, The new beginning. 1 year later, Maggie woke to the sound of Grace's laughter echoing through the Oregon farmhouse, no longer startled by joy, but embracing it as the natural soundtrack of their lives. Sunlight streamed through windows that had never known bars or reinforced glass, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the morning air. The kitchen bustled with familiar chaos. Samuel flipped pancakes while Lily argued with Lucas about whose turn it was to feed the chickens they'd impulsively adopted last spring. Emma sat at the farmhouse table reviewing Grace's developmental milestones, her medical training now channeled into protective love rather than clinical detachment. Rebecca coordinated everyone's schedules with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to treasure every ordinary moment. Grace toddled toward Maggie, her vocabulary expanding daily with words that belonged entirely to her. No scripts, no manufactured responses, just authentic human development unfolding at its own pace. Maggie swept her youngest daughter into her arms, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. The hypervigilance that had once made her flinch at sudden movements had gradually softened into normal parental awareness. Grace represented more than David's genetic legacy. She was proof that love could flourish even in soil poisoned by betrayal. The farmhouse bore little resemblance to their old Victorian home, but it had become something better, a sanctuary built on conscious choices rather than nostalgic reconstruction. Every piece of furniture, every family tradition, every house rule had been deliberately selected by people reclaiming their right to decide their own lives. "The verdict's in," Emma announced, looking up from her phone. The final criminal trial had stretched for months, each testimony and piece of evidence another step toward justice. The room fell silent except for Grace's contented babbling. Dr. Reeves had been the last defendant, his corporate lawyers fighting until the bitter end to minimize his culpability. But the evidence had been overwhelming. Herb Whitmore's meticulous documentation, combined with testimony from dozens of victims, had painted an undeniable picture of systematic abuse. "Guilty on all counts," Emma continued, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. 25 to life. No possibility of parole. The relief was palpable but muted. Justice felt important but insufficient after so much loss. Herb Whitmore was gone, his mind destroyed by the very procedures he'd helped expose. David remained dead, his brilliance silenced 31 years ago. Thousands of other victims scattered across the country were still piecing together fractured identities, some too damaged to ever fully recover. But Grace gurgled and reached for Samuel's pancake, her innocent appetite for life undimmed by the darkness that had preceded her birth. She would grow up in a world slightly safer because her family had refused to surrender to Meridian's cruelty. "There's something else," Rebecca said carefully. She'd been working with victim advocacy groups, helping coordinate support services for Meridian's other survivors. The Portland office called. They've identified 3 more children separated from their families in the early 2000s. Siblings who've spent 20 years thinking they were orphans. The work would never end completely. Meridian's experiments had created ripples of trauma that would take generations to fully address. But each family reunited, each false memory gently corrected, each authentic relationship restored represented victory, snatched from the ruins of corrupted science. Maggie looked around the kitchen, cataloguing faces that had become precious beyond measure. Lucas, who'd channeled his father's analytical mind toward environmental law, fighting corporate malfeasance with David's relentless integrity. Lily, whose artistic gifts had survived 30 years of suppression, painting landscapes that captured beauty Meridian could never manufacture. Samuel, still drawn to healing but now working with trauma victims, transforming his own pain into compassionate expertise. Emma, whose medical career focused on ethical research oversight, ensuring other families would be protected from what they'd endured. Rebecca, who'd become a fierce advocate for patient rights, her teenage rebelliousness evolved into adult activism. They were not the same people they would have been without Meridian's interference. That innocent family from the photograph was gone forever, their natural development interrupted and artificially redirected. But the people they'd become carried strength forged in darkness, empathy earned through suffering, and appreciation for freedom that could never be taken for granted. "Family meeting tonight," Maggie announced, using their ritual phrase for important discussions. "The advocacy group wants us to consider expanding our involvement. More testimony, more publicity. The decision would be theirs collectively, as always. They'd built their new life on the radical principle that their voices, their choices, their very thoughts belonged to them alone." Grace clapped her hands at the announcement, too young to understand but responsive to the love that surrounded every family gathering. She would grow up believing that having a voice in important decisions was natural, that family meant safety and support and honest communication. Outside, the Oregon mountains stood eternal and unmarked by human cruelty, offering perspective that transcended individual tragedy. Maggie had learned to find peace in such moments, not the fragile contentment that could be shattered by revelation, but the deeper calm that came from accepting both darkness and light as part of life's complete truth. The woman who'd escaped Riverside in desperate flight had found something infinitely more valuable than the past she'd sought to reclaim. She'd found the future,